Look, we know driving on the left side of the road is the correct way, like in United Kingdom and in Australia. So why do people drive on the right side? Well, let's find out.
A few years ago, my friend and I went to Hawaii and we rented a car to get around. Here's me on day one, the car still in the parking lot, looking a little terrified at the prospect of driving.
So for the first time ever, back in October 2021, I drove on the right side of the road when we went to Mallorca. It was so weird. I think Charlie had to keep reminding me which direction to look at roundabouts in the way that we're going to go. You soon get used to it though. I think driving is like riding a bike, isn't it? It becomes natural to you. But the amount of times I would reach with my left hand to change the gears and things like that, it is difficult when you start off with it.
Not because I was tired or because I hate driving. It was because in Australia, you drive on the left side of the road, whereas in the US, you drive on the right. Most countries in the world, about 2/3, drive on the right side, which leaves 1/3 that drives on the left. You might be wondering why people who drive on the left don't just switch over to the right.
No.
The thing is,
No, that's never crossed my mind. My question is, why don't people on the right side cross over to the left? That is the only ever thought I've had on that subject.
left-hand side traffic was the worldwide norm for a long time. So how come a split now exists? Well, the reason boils down to two main factors. One, the fact that most people are right-handed, and two, the fact that countries were using different forms of transportation at the time formalised road rules began to emerge. Back in the Middle Ages, way before cars existed, people mainly travelled around on horseback or by foot. People kept to the left so they could keep their dominant hand closer to the centre of the road. Remember, this was a time when people often carried weapons on them, such as swords, knives or daggers, while travelling because of bandits and outlaws. Also, people almost always mount horses from the left side, and it's safer to mount from the roadside than in the middle of the road. This left side travelling continued for years across the world until about the time of the French Revolution. There was a big class distinction on the roads of France at the time. The wealthy would drive their carriages on the left and force poorer people to travel to the right. But by the end of the revolution, the aristocracy began travelling on the right to blend in with the lower classes, and France's roads effectively became right-side travel. So you had France travelling on the right.
So that's interesting. So it was partly down to the class system that changed it. But a lot of the driving on the left side to start off with was due to how you mounted a horse, basically, in the brief explanation.
And places like England travelling on the left. Throughout Britain, it was more a matter of custom than widespread regulation until 1835, when Parliament passed a law forcing traffic to keep left. In France, the keep right rule was established more firmly by this guy. As Napoleon conquered countries across Europe, those countries were forced to switch sides. Meanwhile,
Wow. So that's interesting. The fact that obviously with the French civil unrest and whatnot, that was what made them drive on the right. But then when Napoleon decided to go crazy and take over places, he decided to make them drive on the right as well, which sort of makes sense because you want to make sure things are the same as it is in your country if you're taking over other countries. So that sort of makes sense. Yeah, a perfectly good explanation so far. But what about the Yanks?
In the US, one particular wagon was a big driving force for keeping to the right. The Conestoga wagon became popular in the late 1700s as a way to transport heavy goods. These massive wagons could hold thousands of kilograms worth of cargo and needed teams of horses to pull them along. There was no driver's seat, so the driver would usually sit on the rear left horse, so they could still hold a whip in their hand. Because of this, the wagons travelled on the right, so the driver sitting on the left would have more visibility over the rest of the road. In 1792, Pennsylvania officially passed the first keep right law in the US to this turnpike. 12 years later, New York enforced right-hand travel on all public highways, and it slowly spread across the rest of the US. In time, more and more countries shifted to the right. As they found themselves surrounded by converted land neighbours, it was just easier to follow suit. When the US started putting steering wheels on the left, that became extra incentive to switch.
So if they brought, she brings up the point that because neighbors such as like United States started driving on the right. Neighbors of the United States, Mexico and whatnot, and Canada, I assume, they then switched to the right just because it is easier. When you're changing from country to country, it is easier. So maybe why the UK and Australia have stuck to the left is actually because we are islands. You know, we don't have a border where we then have to change lane. The only thing is for us, you get off at the Channel Tunnel, off the ferry, and you have to then be on a different lane. But otherwise, we haven't had a reason to change lanes because our neighbours aren't landlocked.
Cars initially had the wheel on the right, following horse-drawn buggies. Ford was the first to put the wheel on the left, with the Model T in 1908. Initially, it was just to make disembarking easier, but car manufacturers soon realised it was better and safer for the driver to sit more towards the centre of the road. And because the US is such a big car exporting country, this was an extra push for more countries to switch over to the right, so they could use the cars. Obviously, not everyone made the switch. British colonies stayed on the left and still do for the most part. And countries like Japan and Thailand that were never British colonies but had dealings with the British also kept to the left. But most countries switched to the right in the early to mid 20th century. In fact, only 3 places have switched back from right to left in recent times. In Japan, Okinawa was controlled by the US after World War II and made to drive on the right. It switched back to the left on July 30th, 1978, after being returned to Japan 6 years previously.
See, I'm wondering how difficult it is to convert from left to right or right to left, and in these cases, left to right and right to left. Because signs have to be changed. I'm sure there's stories of how signs have to be changed overnight. Everywhere needs to be changed overnight. So then when people wake up and start driving, it is changed, ready for use. I'm sure there's stories about that, and I can't remember where from.
Timor-Leste switched to the left under Indonesian rule in 1975, and Samoa switched over in 2009 so they could import old Australian cars instead of more expensive US cars. The Samoans had a smooth changeover. They got a 2-day national holiday to ease traffic and had a 3-day ban on alcohol to deter accidents. But they had a relatively small population at the time of about 180,000 people. So what would happen in a country with a lot more people and a lot more that could go wrong? Sweden switched from left to right in 1967. With a population of about 7.8 million people at the time, there was a lot to prepare for H-Day.
I think this is what I'm talking about. It was Sweden. I'm sure I've heard this story.
Markings had to be repainted, bus stops relocated, intersections and one-way streets redesigned, and about 360,000 street signs changed. At precisely 5 a.m. on September 3rd, Swedes were directed to switch over to the right. The whole process cost 628 million krona, the equivalent of more than $400 million today. But the country's road networks and infrastructure are a lot more sophisticated now than they were 50 years ago. Not to mention there are a lot more people and cars. A switch nowadays would be a lot harder and cost a lot more. It's the main reason why we won't see another country switching sides anytime soon. It would be a huge logistical exercise that would cost a lot more than people are willing to spend for something that isn't needed. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. In the end, it only took a day or two for us to be comfortable driving on the other side of the road, and it's probably what travellers will have to keep doing. You may have noticed that most left-side driving countries are actually islands, which helps justify not switching over.
That's what I said.
For the few that do share borders with right-side driving countries, most of the time it's a non-issue. You'd have to go through customs first, so you go through border security on one side and exit out the other. But for a few countries, they've come up with some inventive solutions.
Hang on, I'm trying to work this out. So from China to Macau, there's a funky bridge. Does it... She's got to explain this one, please. She's not going to. Well, that's a strange bridge. So I was sort of right, wasn't I? That the reason why a lot of the left-hand driving, the left lane driving, don't change is because we're islands. We don't need to change. What is the point of us changing? But it showed that the reasons why countries did change to right lane driving, and that was, for example, the French had a civil war, and it was down to classes and how the upper class used to drive on the left and the working class had to be on the right. And then it meant that when they did change, Napoleon took over places and forced them to drive on the right side. Then you have countries like America where the vehicles that they ended up using, or should I say the horse-drawn carriages that they were using, meant that it was just more practical for them to drive on the right. And then when cars were made and invented, they automatically obviously started on the right. And it was just easier for countries around the United States and other countries like that just to drive on the right, because if you're going from country to country, it is a faff to go from right to left or left to right. Whereas obviously us island countries don't need to worry about it because we're not having that landlocked situation. It's interesting. And actually, most of that stuff I didn't have a clue about. I had no idea of the reasons why countries drive on the right. Still really weird, and you should probably drive on the left. But I'm open. If I have to drive on the right lane, so be it. Hello, Pixie. Hang on, get a little head in. And before we finish the video, there you go. Thank you so much for watching. What lane do you drive in? Do you drive on the left or do you drive on the right? Let me know in the comments down below, and I will catch you next time.